Hey everyone, welcome back to Chat Sematary. Today is the final episode of the podcast. I had so many intentions to get out a Holly episode, but it just didn't work out for various reasons. And I will say, I enjoyed the book. Maybe I will give some non-spoiler thoughts on it later in this episode. But right now I am joined by Drew Dietsch and Travis Newton to wrap up the podcast. They have some questions for me. I have no idea what they are. I'm excited to find out though. But Drew, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. It is very nice to have the Mangler 2 crew reunited for this final episode.
Yeah. Travis, how about you? How are you doing?
Doing okay. Glad to be back for this very special episode.
Yeah, it is something that I certainly did not expect to be doing, but life happens, and I just want to quickly give a shout out to some other Stephen King podcasts, because if there's anyone listening to this who does not listen to any other King podcasts, I would highly recommend checking out The Losers Club, The King Cast, Underrated Stephen King. There are so many more that I am spacing on the names of because there's so many different iterations of Stephen King things in the names that I don't want to get any confused and give you all wrong information. But there's a lot of shows out there that I think are really well done and will certainly give you that Stephen King fix.
Oh, for sure. Well, I would like to know, as somebody who has not only been a guest of the show, but also a listener, is why have you chosen this time to finally close out Chat Sematary?
I tend to close out podcasts at the end of the year, it seems. At least that is what I did last year with Welcome to Geekdom. Part of it is just because my job is editing podcasts all day. So there are times when it's just a lot harder for me to work in both recording and editing episodes into my schedule. It's actually funny. It has become increasingly harder to schedule episodes of this podcast now that I am not doing it weekly.
Interesting. Yeah.
I think without the backlog of stuff to get through too, something that's coming out now is not going to be somebody's favorite Stephen King novel immediately.
Right.
It's not going to work like that. Whereas there are novels that people have loved for decades that people are excited to talk about, like Drew and I coming on to do the things that we did. Like, yeah, there are reasons we chose those specific things. We were really excited to talk about them. Like the prospect of doing something new, especially something like, you and I had briefly talked about me doing the Holly episode with you, but like when I found out the audiobook was 15 hours long, like I balked. So like that was a huge investment of time for, what would have been ultimately like a short discussion on the internet about it. And I just thought, I actually don't know if I can carve out the time in my schedule to read a book that will take me 15 hours. And I don't even know if I'm going to like it, because I hadn't even read any of the Mr. Mercedes stuff, except for I had read Outsider.
It's tough too, because part of it is like, okay, do I get someone on the podcast who has an advanced copy and will have extra time to read it? Do I wait a month or two for someone else to finish reading the book? Because I picked up Holly through like pre-ordering it. So it basically, I'm pretty sure it did arrive on release day, and I knocked it out in like 4 days. It was just one of those things where, with, like you were saying, the new stuff, it's hard to gauge interest in it because there are a lot of people who will read the new Stephen King books immediately. But also now it feels like that weight has sort of been lifted off of my shoulders because I don't feel the need to do that.
Right.
And it's not that I don't want to. It's just I rarely ever read new books like the weekend or the week they come out. It's just not something I do. I have such a huge backlog of older books that I haven't even gotten through that for me, I'm just like, okay, I have plenty of other things to read. And I, at times, am very much a mood reader. So it's like, if I'm not in the mood for something, I either take forever to get through it, or I just end up never finishing it, and like by the time I return to it, I have to start over.
Yeah, there is, and all three of us can attest to this. In what we do, Drew and I have done a weekly movie podcast since I joined it in 2016. And sure, we've taken weeks off, but like by and large, it's kept rolling, ever since I joined it for, I think, when Robert Eggers' The Witch came out.
Okay.
I think it was February of 2016. So I would love like a Spotify wrapped kind of thing where it's like, this is how many hours you spent, reading or watching when you really didn't want to.
Yeah.
It's another kind of like year-end thing, like in retrospective, it's like, wow, how many hours did I spend on this? Because like, I wouldn't look at it as hours wasted. I would really look at it as hours like devoted to a craft, like devoted to an idea. Do you feel like you've really devoted yourself and like threw yourself into this as best you could?
I feel like I did, especially for like the 3 straight years of just doing weekly episodes.
I've seen the spreadsheets. You did.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the thing is, like, when I started this, I had maybe a handful of podcasts that I was working on. So I had a ton of extra hours in the day to devote to reading and watching everything. And I feel like for me, I'm very much a person who is all or nothing on something. So to only have a few episodes coming out a year now, the momentum was not there anymore. And I think that is part of, along with the challenges of getting people who have read and enjoyed the newer things on, is just being able to go like 2, 3, 4 months without an episode and seeing all of the movies get delayed and delayed and delayed, and some just disappear altogether. And because I went through everything so quickly, granted, like 3 years is a good run for a podcast, and it's been longer than that since I've kind of tried to keep it going.
Yeah, 3 years is an excellent run. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, it's an excellent run, especially for a podcast that has a specific devoted theme and like it's one thing to be like, yeah, we did a podcast for 3 years where we got together every weekend and drank beers and just talked and recorded it and put it online. Like, it's like, okay, yeah, you did that for 3 years. Good job. But like, you picked out, like I had such, respect and admiration for you, because it wasn't just that, okay, I'm going to do every Stephen King novel. Okay, I'm going to do every Stephen King book. No, I'm going to do like every Stephen King thing that I can. Like, I'm going to do books, movies, television shows, comic books, as anything that could fall under the web that you could do on your show and get somebody to talk about. You did. And that was like so impressive. And one of the reasons why I was so attracted to being on the show was because it's like, yeah, of course I love Stephen King, but it's like it's not just, hey, we're only going to talk Stephen King movies. It's like, no, it was everything. And in that kind of all-encompassing view, I do have a couple kind of questions here. I'd just like to know, because I'm curious, and one of them talking about, I guess this would be a good follow-up, talking about reading the newer books and things. Over the course of doing this, have you noticed any very substantial changes or shifts or anything in King? I mean, obviously, when it comes to his books, that's going to be the most direct line, but just kind of, Stephen King in general, have you noticed a change or a trend as things got, to a more modern place? Like, do you view past works in a certain different light as opposed to the modern stuff? Just like kind of just a very basic or generalized, like, what's kind of been your change in appraisal over imbibing so much Stephen King content over the years? Like, what have you kind of seen over the years in terms of, have things changed? Has he, stuck to a lot of the same stuff? Like, just what's kind of been a big overall learn that you've gotten from doing this as an experiment?
Yeah, just the fact that he has released books in 6 different decades. I feel like he's done a great job of progressing with the times. Sure, it is not always perfect, as it never really is with anyone who grew up in like the time period that King grew up and is now the age that they are. There are things that are going to sort of stick with them and might not come across super well. And I think I've more so seen that in King's social media than necessarily his writing at times, but there are certain things, like when I was going through and doing the podcast, that just did not age very well. Obviously, there are the iconic books like Carrie, The Shining, The Dead Zone, and, The Dead Zone really being sort of that first introduction to just how political King's work can be, I think has been very interesting to see, the progression from that to something like Holly, which does get into politics a bit, and something like Thinner, I think, is the one that really sticks out to me as something that did not age well. But for me, what I tried to do is I tried to look at all of these works in the time frame that they were released in. It's not really fair to judge something from 1977 through a 2023 lens,
No, of course not. And certainly I don't mean that, because I read things that would probably get me jailed in that regard.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, I guess overall, do you see, like, would you say King has maintained, let's say, a very strong political voice throughout his writing? Has it become, would you say, like, recent books feel that kind of writing or messaging is more obvious or to the forefront than in past works? And that's just a very specific example. Just in general, like, because a common thing I've always heard about Stephen King is that he desperately needs a better editor. And there's the sense that, well, at some point he became Stephen King, and people will kind of, he might be allowed to go a little longer or be a little bit more flowery.
Yeah.
He'll indulge more, but like, one of the things that, like, I think I've noticed about, like, the way Deanna maybe, like, feels about Stephen King is, like, the fairy tale episode, I think would kind of distill that well. Like, yeah, King's always King, but he's still morphing, he's still changing with the time. Like, the big difference with something like fairy tale is he's actually writing from a very young character's perspective for King, and for somebody who's young in sort of the contemporary sense, like somebody who's Gen Z, I think. And for him to be able to adapt his voice and his sort of Kingisms to that time period, and to have it not feel silly. Like, yes, he does dive into the occasional, like, weird, turn of phrase, or like old timey, old timey thing, like, King, like, what are you doing? You sound, again, like fresh out of the 50s, kind of hokey and folksy. But like he has warped with the warped and changed with the times for good or ill, or neither. But at the end of the day, King's always gonna King. The brand is still as strong as it ever was.
Yeah, and Travis, when we did the fairy tale episode, that was actually one of the more recent books that I just had so much trouble getting into. And, I know there have been certain episodes, especially that one, where I'm like, oh, maybe at some point I'll go back and revisit it. And I think part of me sometimes felt guilty when I didn't love something that King wrote. And at the same time, I've had some reviews on the podcast that were just like, too many 3 stars. And it's just like, I've reached a point where I don't feel the need to keep up with every single new, like, Marvel, Star Wars, DC release or whatever. And that was like a weight lifted off my shoulders when Welcome to Geekdom ended. And then with this, it's like, you know what? I did this because I wanted to go through and read this author's works. And I needed to give myself a deadline in order to make that happen. And I was like, okay, let's try to do something fun with it, turn it into a podcast kind of thing. And now that I've reached the end of not only the podcast, but, being caught up with everything. And granted, there are still like a couple nonfiction things that I haven't read yet, like his essay collection called Secret Windows and a few other things here and there. But for the most part, I'm just like, you know what? I don't have to like everything that Stephen King does. I don't have to revisit things that I didn't like. If I didn't initially click with fairy tale and like it, it was probably for a reason, and that reason probably wasn't just the fact that I was in the middle of moving to a new state.
Right. It's not like this was ever a stan podcast. You weren't here to stan. You were really just here to examine the body of work. And like, for me, what I find so fascinating about this project, like as a a task to take on is like Stephen King is one of our most like prolific popular writers.
Yeah.
And what is it like to kind of take on a prolific creation? Like you really had to create prolifically and like read prolifically to get this done. But, you know, do you feel like that almost brings you closer to King in a way? Or how do you feel about the whole, you know, work of just taking on something where you know you're going to have to read and write and create so much?
Yeah, honestly, I think it really did help deepen my love of horror. And I know that not everything King writes is horror. You have the whole Bill Hodges trilogy. You have the novels where it's more fantasy driven, like the Dark Tower series and Fairy Tale. And I know that not everything is strictly horror, but there's always horrific elements to each of his novels, regardless of what the quote unquote main genre is. And I think reading everything that King has written, for the most part, has really made me want to explore the genre more, because obviously there are plenty of white men who have written horror novels, King being the biggest of them. But there are a lot of authors who are like people of color who have been inspired by King and have said as much. And I just want to see how, you know, those authors took that inspiration and sort of turned it into their own thing that blends like their own experiences. Because sometimes when we do see King writing younger characters now and it's set in a more present timeline, I'm like, okay, it doesn't feel forced. It just feels like he's still trying to get a grasp on that. Whereas with something like It, you could tell it's like, okay, King is very familiar with this time period. He was younger during this time period. This all tracks. So I would love to just read more current authors because of this. And I don't know if that necessarily makes sense, but to me, it makes sense.
I kind of get what you're saying in that, like, when Stephen King is writing It, he's writing about his youth.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? There's a lot of kind of self-insert in that where he remembers a period and he remembers an era. You know, when he writes something like Fairy Tale, he's not necessarily writing about his youth as he is, you know, just writing about the universal experience of what it is to, you know, to be a teenager. And he certainly has that experience, but he's had to grow and adjust. I get what you're saying. Drew, what is next on your list of questions?
Oh, okay. You know, you're talking about different titles and stuff. And I mean, obviously, I want to walk away with this with some titles to highlight. And I would ask Deanna, if there was somebody out there, let's just pretend this person exists.
Okay.
That has no radar on Stephen King at all. Like like nothing. And then for one day they stumble into you knowing that you're an authority on Stephen King because of this podcast, and is like, hey, I would like to get into Stephen King. What's a book and a movie that you would recommend to someone that you think if you read this, watch this, you will get bit by the Stephen King bug?
Oh boy, this is a tough question because of
I'm
what I just mentioned with how there's so many different genres technically that King has written in.
Oh, sure. And to be clear, I'm not saying that these need to be your personal like favorite book or favorite movie or anything.
Yeah.
If you're like, I think this is like it's like, this is just such a good story. And it's like, you know, for the book, for example, be like, this is just such a good story and it's so written well. And it's going to give you like the initial hit that's going to make you be like, okay, what else does this guy do? And what else can I get? And then you can, you know, start finding your specificities. But is there a book and a movie that you would say, like, if you read this, if you watch this, you're going to want more Stephen King?
Yeah, I would probably go relatively neutral on the book. I'm never going to be like, hey, you should read It as your first Stephen King book because it is massive and dense, and some people really do not like clowns. So with all of that in mind, I think King is at his best when he is just writing about human monsters, you know? So I think for the book, I would actually recommend Misery.
Great choice.
That is amazing. I am currently reading Misery for the first time. Wow, that's some beautiful cosmic lattice work. I'd never read it before, and I started reading it. And the first night I read it, I got through half of the book, and was like fighting to stay awake. So I'm like, I want to keep reading this. This is so good.
And it's great because Misery is like an amazing story throughout all of its versions. It's an incredible novel. It's an amazing film. And if you've ever seen it on stage,
Yes,
it slaps.
I would love to see that.
The play is incredible. I had the privilege of seeing that at a local theater maybe 15 years ago. And it was just a local production with local actors, but like it makes such a great stage play. So yeah, Misery is an excellent choice.
Yeah, picking Misery is so awesome because I honestly think that's a very good choice for that because it's got all of the King flavor, but it actually is like a lot of his, I won't say worst, but some of his more indulgent inclinations don't overflow in that book at all. It's a really tightly constructed book, and I've got about a little less than, I don't know, maybe 50 pages left.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's one of the books that really doesn't get outside the scope of its own tight little narrative. Like even stuff like Cujo, which would have been like my initial thought, gets like, I don't know, a little bit outside of what it's really talking about with the whole like Charity Camber stuff.
Yeah.
So it's like slightly deeper cut.
It's another one of his more world building novels in the sense of like, he's going to spend 8 pages with this one guy that's going to get killed on page 9. Like, but it's because it's building out this world, whereas the world of Misery is so, self-contained purposefully that doesn't have to, he doesn't have to get bogged down in all that. It really is just like character and story. Like that's.
Yeah. The claustrophobia really works in the story's favor in that way. And the story creates the claustrophobia.
That's awesome that you pick Misery and that I'm currently reading it. I love the magic of that. But is there a movie that you think would have a similar effect on somebody? Like, hey, if you saw this movie, this is going to key you in on like, hey, you're going to want to watch more Stephen King movies.
Yeah, I think the movie is a little tougher because part of me is like, okay, do I lean a little more horror with the movie pick, but not so much so that someone's going to be like turned off of King stuff? And it's really hard for me to want to pick something that's really long, like The Green Mile or Shawshank, just because they're not the best introduction. Those are like, hey,
right,
if you really want to sit with something.
And even though those are good, good movies.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if they'd be the thing necessarily to be like, now I need to check out more Stephen King. They're like, well, his other stuff's about like killer clowns and things called Langoliers, so it's going to be a little different.
Yeah. I think the happy medium between just getting these like real, intensely personal stories with some creepy stuff going on is going to be The Mist.
Ooh, okay. Yeah, just as we record this, had a new 4K come out. I mean, The Mist is a good one. And I think that's a good one in the sense of it gets all of the human drama that King is so good at, that has nothing, devoid of any genre attachment. Just the human drama is good, but it's also chock full of fun horror stuff. So I like those. And now I just want to keep reading Misery because I have 50 pages left or something, and I'm so anxious to finish that book.
Yeah, and to go back to Misery real quick, Travis, you mentioned the play of Misery and how you just saw a local one. If I'm not mistaken, I think Bruce Willis was in one of the play versions of Misery.
The Jimmy Caan role, yeah.
Yeah, he's Paul Sheldon. And then what's from Roseanne?
Laurie.
Oh, goodness. Metcalf?
Yes.
Laurie Metcalf, was Annie Wilkes.
That's amazing.
I remember that making the rounds. I just want to read Misery. So those would be the ones you'd recommend.
Yeah.
But is there something that you would consider a contender for the absolute bottom of the barrel worst Stephen King book? or now here's the thing. I don't want you to pick a book and a movie and a TV show or something. Just, is there like a book, a movie, a TV show that you were like, this is the nadir of Stephen King? And I would say like, something like The Mangler 2 doesn't really count. It's too devoid.
That's too derivative.
Yeah, I would say if it was a movie, it has to be like, a direct adaptation of one of his novels or works, or just a novel of his. Is there something that you were like, I can't believe that this creator, who I am, enamored with as a creator, made this? It is so repellent.
Oh, goodness. Everyone who has listened to this podcast knows how much I dislike the Tommyknockers, but I understand that it is something that will work to some extent for some people. So I'm not going to go with that.
Yeah, I will say just real quick before you do pick, the Tommyknockers is, and I have it, I've never read it, does seem to be like the novel. It's like that and Dreamcatcher are the ones that everyone are like, you don't need to read that. Like, which makes me, I mean, I read Dreamcatcher and now I can say it's like, you don't need to read that.
You don't need to read
that.
Yeah.
But the Tommyknockers has still been one for decades that I'm like, yeah, nobody seems to go to bat for this.
Yeah. Oh, man. See, here's the thing. I actually really like the Mangler story, and I think first movie is very fun. So despite what we have said about 2 and 3, that's definitely not the bottom for me. So I think, I might have to go with the Langoliers.
Okay. The Langoliers, the TV movie, or the specific, like the story as well?
Both.
Okay.
Can it be both?
Yeah, no, it can absolutely be both. That's interesting. Because I'm trying to think if there's anything, because I'm trying to think of ones that I remember you being very like not into. Because I want to say you weren't.
Cell is another one.
Cell, yeah.
Where does Fairy Tale fall on that spectrum? I gotta know.
I'm betting that's like a 3-star.
Yeah, it was fine. I didn't actively dislike it. It just wasn't the King novel for me.
Where was like the struggle hardest for you? Like I know that recently the struggle was like, can I actually get an episode made? Like, is this going to continue? But like when you were in the thick of it, still doing weekly episodes, like where was the low point?
Oh, goodness.
Yeah. Was there a particular book that you're like, I would drop this in a second if I wasn't doing this show?
Yeah. I'd rather rip my frickin' toenails out. Yeah.
Yeah. But I have to get through it because I have to do the episode this week. Like, was there a book or a movie that was just like insufferable to the point where it was like, I don't want to be here anymore. It's just like, totally, I think you should leave. Just, I don't want to be here anymore.
I know I had some tough stretches of the podcast where it was just like no movies or TV shows had come out. So I had like a stretch of 11/22/63, Duma Key, like these massive books all in a row. And I was just like, oh, this is a lot. Oh, it was Duma Key, Just After Sunset, and Under the Dome. I think from a getting things done perspective, that was the toughest, not because I disliked the material, but because Duma Key is big. Just After Sunset is a pretty big collection, and Under the Dome, you could murder someone with the size of that book. Sure. Like it is huge. I have the hardcover. It is the biggest book I have, I think.
It's a doorstopper in the extreme. And then the fact that they would like added insult to injury and made the TV show as long as he did, it's like,
God, that's right. That I think I watched like 2 episodes of that maybe, and then it was like out, done, no. Like
yeah. And then like, I only had one movie before having to do then Full Dark, No Stars and 11/22/63. So from that perspective, that was like the toughest stretch of the podcast. But from a I do not want to be reading this perspective that you mentioned, Drew, oh my goodness. I think there was a stretch where I didn't really like Desperation or The Regulators all that much, and those released on the same day. But I think as far as I don't want to finish this book, that was definitely like the Tommyknockers was the first time that happened, which, as you guys know, that was pretty early on in the podcast.
Oh, no, yeah. But now it only makes, you've only added to the decades-long dislike that people have of the Tommyknockers, which only makes me more like, well, when I get around to it, I'm going to be like, all right, what's going on here?
Yeah, I'm kind of fascinated by the Tommyknockers. I would actually appreciate it if some of the Tommyknockers stands would come out of the woodwork and tell me what really lights you up about that, because, like, I ain't read it and I ain't heard anybody talk real nice about it.
Yeah.
So, somewhat on that same note, was there anything in terms of books or movies in doing this, Deanna? Was there a particular King story that surprised you in such a way that it's really stuck with you? And that can be, it doesn't have to be necessarily qualitative, like, oh, I didn't think this was going to be as good and it was great. Or it can just be like, I kind of expected this story to be this or do this, and it really took me in another direction. And that surprise, again, doesn't have to be qualitative. And like the surprise could have been a bad one. You're like, this surprised me so much that like it was, it stuck with me and I, can't believe it. Or a surprise in the sense of like, yeah, this really was not the experience I was expecting at all. And what I got out of it was something different. And maybe that was a good thing. Is there any King story that you feel really kind of clinches the prize for being the most surprising story of his work for you?
Yeah, I think I will give you one of each, a good surprise and a not so good surprise. For me, the one that I actually didn't even know like existed prior to doing the podcast was Cycle of the Werewolf.
Awesome.
And just the fact that it is so different than everything else because, it's not a comic, but it has amazing illustrations that go with it. And just the structure of how that's written, I really, really loved that. And as far as like bad surprises, it just really surprised me which stories of Kings have been adapted so many times. We've talked about Children of the Corn. I'm not even talking about Children of the Corn necessarily with this, but the fact that there's like 3 Mangler movies, 3 sometimes they come back movies. I'm just like, why are these the stories that people seemed to cling to? Because yeah, I know the Dollar Baby thing was a thing up until this year. Actually, I think that program is ending.
Just closed out. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's like, I understand that made it easy to do these, but at the same time, I'm like, there are so many better stories than the ones that have been adapted numerous times. And like I said, I like the Mangler. Whatever happened after the first Mangler movie was not called for by any means.
Sure.
It is truly astonishing the kind of impact the habits of Blockbuster video patrons had on the industry.
Yeah.
And upon the works that we love from an author we appreciate. It's amazing that the kind of legacy that is left simply because like randos would wander into Blockbuster and rents, sometimes they come back.
Yeah. And the fact that we have as many Carrie adaptations as we do, like the Rage Carrie 2 and then 2 remakes after that, I'm like, there comes a point where it's like, if something is just so well done, you should probably just leave it be. And like, in a sense, I understand the second version of The Shining more so because the movie was not well adapted from the story, but the movie is fantastic either way,
Right. I mean, the miniseries, regardless of quality, had a valid argument in doing another iteration of that story. Like, because it's like, yes, the movie's the movie, but we want to do a version that is much closer to what happens in the book. And it's like, okay, regardless of if that's good, bad, that doesn't really matter. It's a worthwhile creative argument to do another version of The Shining. Yeah,
it's actually kind of impressive how much the Mick Garris version of The Shining is not at all in conversation with the Kubrick version. Like it pretty much refuses to have that conversation.
Oh yeah, no, it doesn't want it.
Which is like remarkable. Like it makes it a kind of a remarkably pure piece of work. But like I remember there being conversations about Misery when we were having such conversations around like Star Wars and toxic fandom and that kind of crap. And us thinking like, oh, is it the time to like bring Annie Wilkes back? And they kind of tried to, like when they did Castle Rock season 2, like can we have another Annie Wilkes? And I mean, they did, but I can see that the conversations around toxic fandom, didn't really necessitate another Annie Wilkes interpretation. It turns out the old Annie Wilkes is still the best Annie Wilkes to analyze fandom through.
Yeah.
Whether it's through Kathy Bates's incredible rendition, the play, the book, like whatever it is, like, yes, it's still relevant, but it really didn't need another version. It didn't need to continue the conversation in ways that say like a new Carrie might have needed to. And like, I do sometimes argue for the necessity of a new Carrie. Like when Kim Pierce was announced to be the director of the Carrie remake, I was pretty excited.
Okay.
But I remember being fairly let down. Like when I went and actually saw that movie, it being like so close to the De Palma version's script, I was like, why bother?
Well, that's, I mean, like something like Misery, I would argue we don't need another version of Misery that's going to do just a, like doing Annie Wilkes on that Castle Rock show. It's like, okay, well, the whole impetus of that show is like, we're just going to play around with Stephen King action figures however we want. So it's like, okay, do whatever you want. That's a valid creative thing, because you're not just telling the same story again. If they were going to do Misery now, you'd have to do something like, well, gender swap them and make, different comments on that. Like have it be a psycho male fan towards a female creator or something, and comment on that, because that's not, present in the original text if you have something to do. I'm not saying that version will be good or bad. It's just like, that's a reason. But yes, like you're saying, Deanna, is like, why are some of these the ones? I mean, what it really comes down to is like, well, somebody owns rights and wants to milk them to the grave. So
yeah, or they just appealed to like video rental randos, like Children of the Corn, or Sometimes They Come Back.
Yeah, well, it's like, the third Sometimes They Come Back movie, I don't think was even originally, it's one of those cases where it's like, that wasn't going to be a Sometimes They Come Back movie, but...
No, it was called Frozen.
Frozen, yes.
Yeah, and it's honestly same for Mangler too. That was clearly supposed to be something called Graduation Day.
Right.
And then it was just retrofitted into the Mangler.
Right. So I mean, these things, how much even, it was a testament to your fortitude and your completionism, Deanna, which is something I have great respect for, that you would even do things like the Mangler 2 and Mangler Reborn, when it's like, these aren't really Stephen King movies, like, or stories.
Yeah.
They're in name only, and that's barely. But I like that you went, that you were exhaustive about it. That's, again, one of the things that I respected so much about you and this project. And then the only other question I have, and again, because I'm not necessarily interested in what I'm not interested necessarily in what what you would say is your favorite Stephen King. I'm more interested in, is there a Stephen King story that you feel you are one of the only people that likes it? Like, is there a Stephen King story that you feel you go against the grain when it comes to people? I guess either way, like going both ways. If there's one that you're like, I really like this, and it does not seem to be, if it's not disliked, it's just like, yeah, nobody talks about this, and I really think this is one of his absolute best things, and vice versa. Is there something like, everybody seems to love this and I think it's not good? I just want to know, after doing all this, do you have some against the grain feelings or appraisals of certain Stephen King works?
Yeah, it is interesting because, like, within my friend group, and I think this is more so for the adaptation than the book itself, like, I have a lot of friends who didn't love Dr. Sleep, but I really love Dr. Sleep. But as far as, something that I think maybe a lot of people just haven't read or hasn't been talked about, and maybe this is because it came out within the last few years, but I really love Later, which is the last hard case crime novel that Stephen King did.
Okay.
And I've really liked all three of his hard case crime novels. So The Colorado Kid, Joyland, and Later.
Yeah.
But Later, he finds a way to sort of tie back into his whole Stephen King universe. And I don't want to give spoilers for anyone who hasn't read it.
Okay.
But that just worked really well for me. I thought it was a fun way to do that. And you talked about earlier briefly how a lot of people have said that he needs a better editor. And honestly, the hard case crime novels are so short in comparison to literally everything else he has done, pretty much, that I think those are the ones that I might find myself recommending more often than I probably expected, just because you get a lot of different aspects of King, but I feel like you get them in slightly different confines, because I don't know who edits those books. I don't know if it's someone else or if they just have guidelines that need to be followed or what the deal is. But I've noticed that the hard case crime novels all do tend to be shorter in length. Like, I haven't seen any that look like they're a tome or anything.
Well, I haven't read any of them, but my just outward appraisal was like, he was kind of like doing a little fun bit of play where he's like, well, could I write stories like old dime store pulp novels?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Stephen King's not a pulp writer. So like, for him to be like, can I write pulp, and to actually do it means like, committing to the format.
Well, I mean, he's always,
format is short.
Yeah. I mean, he's always been inspired by pulp fiction in general. But obviously a lot of that's going to lean more towards like, weird tales type, horror influence from a popular perspective. But like, I mean, he's, no stranger to loving old school pulp stuff. So that was always the outward appraisal I got, was like, oh, he's like, trying a thing. Now that I am like super into like two-fisted pulpy crime stories, I always avoided those because it's like, oh yeah, Stephen King's doing a thing, but it doesn't look like, my usual, it's not horror or supernatural or anything. And now hearing this, I'm like extremely enthused to eventually read those 3 books. And that's great. Like, I love that. I love that you're the one that you feel the strongest about, that you would also recommend, is not a typical, Stephen King quote horror story. That's very cool. And now bumping up on my list for those. And then, yeah, I mean, Deanna, I just want to say, like, it has been a genuine honor and a privilege to be even a small part of what you've tried to do with Chat Sematary. As a fellow Stephen King, I mean, I don't care if it makes me the most basic guy ever. It's like Stephen King's my favorite author, and the one that inspires me the most when it comes to fiction. And to be a part of this show, Deanna, it was just we had great conversations, we had great laughs, and I'm glad that we could that we could get together a little bit to celebrate what you did here, because it's an incredible achievement that, in brutal honesty, like, I'm jealous of, that it's like, oh, that you were able to find a way to commit yourself to this specific artist and their specific work and really engage with it as much of it as you possibly realistically could. That's the kind of thing I've always like dreamed about doing with like content. Like, oh, I would just, find this one thing and really hunker down and do it. And you did it. Like, and I'm so pleased to have been a part of it and to be here for the closing out of Chat Sematary. So I just want to thank you, Deanna, for all of your work and all the great episodes that you've given us.
I want to echo all those sentiments and, say that, like, Drew and I know what it's like to go through the ups and downs of content creation, like committing ourselves to a schedule. This was, I think, so much more ambitious and rigorous than anything Drew and I have ever done. And I can't help but admire all the work you put into this. And I can't wait to read more Stephen King, knowing that, like, I have Chat Sematary to listen back to, because there are still so many Stephen King books I haven't read. Like, when I reread Doom McKee one day, I'm definitely going to listen to the episode.
Oh yeah. And now I'll also, for anything else, I'll be messaging Deanna. It's like, hey, Deanna, I just started, Joyland, and I need to tell you things about it. So
yeah, no, I love that. And thank you both so much for, 1, the kind words, and 2, being frequent guests on this podcast. I know that when I started this, I had talked to Katie Schaefer about potentially co-hosting this together. And in my brain, I'm kind of jealous of like the co-host dynamic that you guys have in a sense, but at the same time, I could never ask or expect someone else to do this the way that I did this, especially, Katie has like kids to care for and pets.
Right.
Huge props to Katie. Katie is my favorite co-host, like, by far. And I've got friends on this podcast, so props to Katie.
Heck yeah.
Katie has been fantastic on the podcast and did so many episodes, because there was a stretch at the beginning where I was just having like the same 5 to 10 people on the podcast, and you guys were in that group. And it was one of those things where I was like, okay, this is getting some traction. Let me see if I can branch out and get like other podcasters, get people who write for like Bloody Disgusting, and, just kind of go about it that way to help grow the podcast. And it did accomplish that. And, I never started this podcast or even Welcome to Geekdom with like, yeah, I'm going to do this. This is a thing I'm going to make money on. But then as I started getting more and more podcast work and seeing other people make money on their podcasts, I think that made it hard for me too, because of how much time I was sinking into specifically this one with all of the reading, all of the watching. I watched every season of the Dead Zone TV show because I had lost my mind by that point. But that's neither here nor there. I also watched all 3 seasons of Under the Dome, and we don't need to talk about that ever again.
Yeah, I assume you're one of the 6 people on the planet that watched the entire first season of The Mist.
Yes, probably.
But no, I mean, Deanna, what? No one. I refuse that anyone would begrudge you. You know, hanging up the hat at this point. You've done so much. There is a humongous body of work with Chat Sematary that you have created. You should be nothing but proud. All the guests, ourselves included. You know, I'll speak for them all because they're not here and I don't know most of them. That, you know, we just want to thank you for having this opportunity because we all love Stephen King and you gave us a chance and a forum to talk about it, to discuss it, to get into the nitty gritty of it, to help find stuff, you know, discover things in King's gigantic body of work. And I just want to, again, reiterate that I'm very proud to have been a part of Chat Sematary, and I'm very, very proud of you, Deanna, just of what you've done.
Thank you.
It's an undertaking that I genuinely do not think if many people could have even scratched the surface of in the way that you did. So kudos. You really did something spectacular here.
Truly. Bravo.
I appreciate that. And again, thank you both for being guests multiple times. Drew, you were the anthology king on the podcast. So
see, the fact that I now get to carry that title with me the rest of my life because of this show is just another. It's like, yes, thank you, Deanna. You made that possible. So thank you.
I'll give you that one instead of a Children of the Corn title. Nobody needs that.
I'll take anthology over that.
I want to add to real quick before we go here is with Chat Sematary, I didn't want it to be just like the Losers Club because I did do some research before I started the podcast and I was like, okay, let me see how many Stephen King podcasts are out there. And the Losers Club had just started, I want to say like less than a year before I started Chat Sematary. They weren't super deep into it, but I saw they did like a 4-hour episode on it. And I was like, I'm not doing that.
Yeah. This is the thing about, the 3 of us, we're independent podcasters. We self, we fund through Patreon. We have smaller audiences. We really have some stiff competition out there.
Well, we're also, as opposed to something like Lose Codes, like we don't have a staff. Like we don't have people who are editing our episodes. We're editing our episodes. Like, they things like that are always going to have the backing behind them. And just by having more people involved in it, they're just going to have the backing. But this has always been the kind of art that I've wanted to be evangelical about and support. Is like, this is legit independent, art. Like what you're doing is art. Like, creating these things is art. And while yes, there might be, even before you started this, bigger kids on the block, Chat Sematary is the one that I enjoy because it feels so much more personal. It feels much more intimate. Like it's not, there's nothing corporate going on or corporate feeling, it's like, no, this is just people who really like Stephen King and want to talk about as much Stephen King as they can.
It's also the least bro-y of the Stephen King podcasts, which is amazing.
That too. That I think that's a rarity in the Stephen King podcast sphere. So no, yes, I just think that it's been don't be sad that it's over, be happy that it happened kind of thing. And I'm very happy Chat Sematary happened, that it was able to cross paths with me in my life and for me to be a part of it, because I think it's a wonderful endeavor. And I would hope at the very least at some point somebody could like tell Stephen King, it's like, hey, Stephen King, there's this person out there who like didn't just read your books, but like watched everything and like did everything. And maybe just tell her like, hey, thanks. That's all. So that's all you do.
Yeah, that would be great. Not necessary. Yeah. It would be a little, cherry on top kind of thing. But overall, I think I really did enjoy this process. Like we said, there are always going to be ups and downs. And one of the things that I've just been working on too is like, if I'm not feeling something anymore, just stop, let it go, don't drag it on. I feel like this past year has really been a lot of me just like trying to hold on to the podcast, when the thing that would have been better for both me and the podcast would have been to just, be done when like that third Gwendy's book had come out or something,
Yeah. No, it's time to prioritize yourself. Stephen King will be okay.
Yeah, he sure will.
And his body of work will be okay. So focus on you. We support that.
Well, I think that wraps up this part of the conversation. I know I mentioned, a little spoiler-free Holly review. So if you guys will bear with me for a few minutes, I'll just give some spoiler-free thoughts on that.
Go for it.
Please, go right ahead.
It is a novel where King's political leanings certainly come through. And this is not me saying, oh, I don't want that in works of fiction. I think there's certainly a place for it. As someone who now works on 2 political podcasts that are very much about said person that King does not like, it was one of those things for me where at times reading Holly felt more like work than I would have liked. And I personally love Holly as a character. So I was happy to get more of her. And I also really like Barbara and Jerome as characters. So it was very nice to see how King has progressed all 3 of those characters in particular, and just like the relationship they have with each other. And, I know, Travis, you had mentioned that you haven't read like the Bill Hodges trilogy, but you have read The Outsider. And it's just so great to see King so dedicated to a character in a way that we haven't really seen before, because he really has clung on to Holly in a way that I don't think we've ever seen him do with any other characters, because she's in 5 books now and a novella. That's a lot.
It is. Clearly there was something about Holly that Stephen King sort of felt like resonated with different aspects of his kind of work, in the more crime laden stuff, but also in the horror and monster, laden stuff. Like, from what I understand about the Bill Hodges books and the sort of Mr. Mercedes trilogy, it's like, it is the intersection between Stephen King's sort of like crime and procedural stuff and his supernatural monster stuff.
Yeah. And Holly is very much about like human monsters. Once again, it leans more heavily into that than like, something like Pennywise or what have you. And I think that is a very nice, happy medium for him as of late, especially. And I think it worked well. It wasn't my favorite King novel. I didn't hate it. I don't think I would necessarily even give it 3 stars either. It might be like more in the 3.5, 4 range for me.
Nice.
But, there we go. There's a little spoiler-free review of Holly. Hopefully that didn't give too much away. But I would recommend checking it out, Travis, whenever you have time. But also, I know some people are like waiting to read Holly until they have read through the Mr. Mercedes Finders Keepers End of Watch stuff too.
I don't know. I tend to like wait until everything is done and then read it all backwards.
Yeah.
So,
okay.
Maybe I'll do that.
Yeah. And I think that wraps this up. Do you guys have any last questions, any observations, anything?
No, for me, I just hope that whatever next Stephen King thing you read or watch, you do it knowing that like you don't have to do this anymore. Like you can relax.
You don't have to tell anyone about it even.
Yeah.
You can
literally keep it a
no one needs
secret.
to,
like just like keep it to yourself and fucking enjoy it. Excuse my French, but just enjoy it.
Yeah, I know, Drew, you've probably looked at the spreadsheet a little more recently because we've booked a few episodes prior to this, but there's a lot of stuff about King that isn't necessarily written by King that I do like have an interest in.
Okay.
And it will kind of be nice to just like read about the making of Christine and Cujo without having to talk about the making of Christine and Cujo.
Yeah, there you go. Now, the only thing I'll say is for anybody listening all this way, there's tons of excellent episodes of Chat Sematary to go check out. Go look for the stuff that you like. Go look for stuff to find things so you can discover them through here. And as far as I'm concerned, I'm just very, very happy that you picked Misery as the book to recommend, and I will be finishing Misery as we once we're off the horn here and my day comes to a close. So I'm going to celebrate Chat Sematary's existence by going and reading a Stephen King book. And I hope all of you will as well. If not in the short term, certainly in the long term, is listen to some Chat Sematary episodes and read some Stephen King.
Or watch some movies. You don't have to be a reader to listen to this podcast either, you know? But I also just want to thank all of the listeners, all of the other guests who have been on the podcast. I obviously could not have done this without all of the guests that I've had over the few years that I have done this. And it was a wild ride, to say the least. It really was. And yeah, we'll see what's next. We'll see if I ever get back to making YouTube videos. We'll see what happens. Maybe I'll have another podcast at some point.
Well, I'm sure if you have guests on that, we would be happy to be a part of it.
Yep, absolutely.
Absolutely. Well, thank you to everyone once again. That's a wrap now.
Bye.